Hello, Feisties. Sarah Gross here, founder and CEO of Feisty Media. We are so glad you are here and part of our community. And I wanted to let you all know that today we are running a special episode of the Feisty Women's Performance Podcast across all of our podcast feeds. The Feisty Women's Performance Podcast is hosted by sports psychologist Dr. Erin Ayala. Along with being a mental health expert and therapist, Erin lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which has been at the center of the news over the last month since it became the subject of the largest immigration enforcement action to date in the U.S., with thousands of federal agents patrolling the streets. Those agents have detained U.S. citizens, raided homes and schools, and over this past weekend, shot and killed a second bystander, leading to hundreds of thousands of people protesting in Minneapolis and around the country. It has been tough for many in our Feisty community, and especially for those in the thick of things. So when Erin asked if she could bring together experts on mental health, many of whom are local to Minneapolis as well, and do a special episode on dealing with stress and collective trauma, of course we said yes. What follows is a thoughtful conversation that will help you understand your nervous system, lean on your athletic and sports communities, and remain your best authentic self during trying times. Whether those times are right now with the news in the US or your own challenges you may be dealing with. Thank you to Erin and her guests for this truly insightful conversation.
Okay, Feisties. You don't have to be directly targeted to feel the weight of what's been happening in our world recently. Across Minneapolis and cities across the U.S., immigration and customs enforcement operations have unfolded at a scale we have not experienced, creating fear, fracturing communities, and leaving many of us trying to figure out how the heck we should navigate an environment thick with collective trauma. Maybe you're scrolling, feeling helpless. Maybe you've deleted your social media altogether. Maybe you're wondering if you should say something or if staying quiet is safer. Maybe you're just exhausted or numb. Some of you may be thinking, and others may have been told, to stick to sport, to avoid anything remotely political. So here's the thing about athletes, coaches, podcast hosts, and others being told to stay in your lane. Your lane includes your nervous system. And right now, your nervous system is not staying neutral. Whether you're directly impacted or not by everything that has been happening, your body is registering it. Years ago, I led a study for research that examined what contributes to mental health and performance amongst athletes. I recruited several thought leaders in the field when doing this, and I will never forget the conversation I had with Dr. Bill Parham, the first ever director of the mental health and wellness program at the NBA. This guy knows his stuff. When asked what athletes need to maximize their mental health and performance, there was one thing he really stressed: put the person before the performer. He emphasized that athletes need to do 3 things if they want strong mental health and performance. First, they need to reflect on current events and their psychological impact on individuals, families, and communities. He specifically used the examples of the COVID-19 pandemic, social justice protests, and contentious presidential elections. Second, athletes need to engage in honest self-reflection regarding implicit bias, stereotype threat, microaggressions, and other relational phenomena. And third, we need to regularly engage in honest self-reflection to continuously discover the best version of ourselves as people first and role players second: coaches, players, teammates, friends, siblings, etc. In other words, athlete wellness does not exist in a vacuum. Socio-political events shape our nervous systems, our mental health, our performance, and our wellness. And right now, a lot of community members are not okay. So today, we're talking about something that most sports podcasts will not touch: collective trauma, compound stress, and what athletes and coaches can actually do when the world feels like it's on fire. I'm joined by Dr. Tess Kilwine, board-certified clinical health and sports psychologist on the USOPC Mental Health Directory, Dr. Quincy Guinati, postdoctoral resident who specializes in identity, immigrant experiences, and mental health, and Christine Bright, lead consultant at the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport. In this conversation, we explore how collective trauma shows up in your body in performance, why stick to sport advice ignores basic neurobiology, practical strategies for self-care when everything feels overwhelming, how sport can be part of healing, not escapism, and what authentic allyship actually looks like for people right now. I know this is heavy, but the conversation itself was also very healing. And I know many things may have shifted dramatically between me recording this and you hearing it. That said, it's important to understand the bigger picture, and the advice will still be relevant for years to come. So thank you for leaning in. Here we go. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of a very busy schedule and a very wild time that we're all experiencing, which is frankly why we're here. I know, well, actually, Tess, did you get slammed with the snowstorm?
Yes.
Okay.
Mostly an ice storm by now, but yes.
So we got ice in some parts of the country. I know a lot of parts were slammed this week. And then 3 of us are based in Minneapolis. And so really wanting to talk about what's happening, kind of socio-political climate and how that's affecting folks right now and what we can do about it, what to expect with coping, how we can show up for ourselves, for each other. So to get started, I'd love to, Quincy, I know you've done a lot of work on trauma. All 3 of you have, frankly. But to start with some definitions, one of the things I've been talking about lately with folks is this idea of collective trauma and how it's different from this individual trauma. So what do we mean when we talk about collective trauma, and why is that distinction important for athletes or coaches?
Yeah, I think it's implied in the name itself, right? The collective versus individual and who gets to experience that. Collective trauma is kind of thinking about a group of individuals or a collective of individuals going through the same traumatic experiences. A really good example of a recent collective trauma that we all experience is the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Something that as a collective, we all experience the same thing. I think the last I did the research, more than 1 million Americans died. So a lot of us have personal ties to COVID-19. So that's a really good example of what collective trauma might look like as an example. So it hits a whole community, it hits a whole ecosystem, and it shows up in very different ways, depending on where on the ecosystem you're at, how much privilege you have, how much, what's your identities, what's your background, what's your comfort level with talking about all of this. And it shows up in the team, right? Because the team is its own ecosystem. We have different parts. We have the athletes, we have the coaches, we have the organizers, we have all of these things, and that's going to show up in different ways too.
Interesting. And to take it to you, Christine, I know you love to nerd out over the neurobiology and what's really happening kind of under the hood or inside. So, there's another term that's been floating around, which I've also been using, this idea of compound trauma, really when one thing is layered on top of another. Here in Minneapolis, we've got a lot of immigrant communities. We have a strong Native community. So that could be an example of compound trauma where it's layered, ongoing traumatic experiences. How does it show up in the body and the brain? What are people probably experiencing, whether or not they know it?
Right on. I do like to nerd out about the brain. What I know about the brain comes from Dr. Bruce Perry and the neurosequential network and model. And basically, I'm going to give you a short brain lesson, if that's okay with you.
Excellent.
I know you may already know it, but for our listeners, what we know about the brain in very simple terms is that we can think about it in sort of 3 parts that build on each other. The first part being the survival brain, or it's called our brainstem, but that's the first part of our brain to develop. Then comes sort of our emotional brain or our limbic system and its friends. And then the third part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, or sort of our executive brain, our most human part of our brain where we do our best thinking. And so the brain develops in that order, and all information comes through that same order. So it's kind of the first thing the brain says is, hey, am I safe? That's our survival brain talking to us, and checking to make sure we're safe. If we're safe, then the next part of the brain it sort of passes through kind of like an elevator to the next floor, the emotional brain. Do I belong? Am I part of this community? And if that feels good, if you feel like you belong, then it goes to that final floor of the elevator, that prefrontal cortex, where we can do sort of our creative thinking, or sort of like our planning, or all of our very smart stuff that we do. The challenge comes when we can't answer those questions. Am I safe and do I belong? In the positive, right? That's when our stress response is activated. And when our stress response is activated, we lose access to that final part of our brain, until our stress response can come back down when we feel that safety and that belonging. So compound trauma we have communities that are before this metro surge. We had communities that were already experiencing all sorts of overwhelming stress and trauma, not feeling safety, not feeling like they belonged. And then we put this right on top of that, which made it harder if their stress responses were coming down sometimes, if they felt safe with their teammates, if they felt safe in their homes, if they felt safe at school or in their gym or wherever their place of worship. If they were able to bring that stress response down, this additional overwhelming stress is going to make it harder for them to find that baseline of safety and belonging.
And how is it like, how are we likely feeling it, or how is it likely showing up for folks? Whether for mental health, I think focus, concentration, attention, emotion regulation. What are people usually experiencing in these types of situations?
Yeah. For a second there, I thought you were going to ask. I can tell you how it's showing up for me, but it shows up differently in each body, right? But it's sort of like, if you can imagine like almost getting in a car accident and what that feels like in your body, right? Your like heart rate, it's different in each body too, right? I always say that I sweat right away. I maybe react really sharply and quickly in a way that wouldn't be typical for me, but I'm like feeling body things, and I'm also feeling a little bit rougher around the edges with the way I'm talking to people, even in my like close community, right? And so if you imagine those chemicals that sort of protect you, right, when your stress response goes up, but they keep dumping into your brain to the point where they're no longer protecting you. They're making it harder for you to think or focus or do the other things that you might want to do during your day besides stay safe when you feel like you almost got in a crash.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think, Tess, I know I don't know if you've had similar conversations. I know you work specifically with athletes as a sports psychologist. I do as well. A lot of my athletes are feeling really stuck, right? This like wanting to do something, not sure what the quote unquote right thing is to do, afraid of being performative or saying the wrong thing. What advice do you have for folks who have been sitting in some of these tensions and experiencing some of these?
Yeah, I describe it to people. I use this term angst. Like that's what people are feeling. It's, maybe this tension or this pulling to want to do something and not knowing why. I call it angst. And I tell people, listen to that, because every emotion we have is a messenger. It's trying to tell you to do something. And angst is telling you to act, like it wants you to do something, right? So athletes are in this really unique position to engage in activism because they often have platforms, whether that's social media or otherwise, visibility, influence in their communities. And, they're often leaders in spaces and social spaces in their communities, on their teams. And they're in this unique position, but activism is really messy. And I think we have a lot of perfectionist people in athlete and performance spaces that they're like, if I can't do it perfectly, I'm not going to do it at all. So what I tell people, there is no perfect way to do it. Even the most well-trained activists who have been in this space for a really long time don't do it perfectly. Like they embrace the messiness of it. So if you're waiting until you feel fully ready, that's where you feel stuck. So instead of waiting for that moment, recognize everyone starts somewhere, right? And I think that performance or not wanting to be performative piece is really important, because starting somewhere doesn't mean centering yourself in a movement that you're just entering. So it doesn't mean like, okay, now you're the expert or you go straight to the streets depending on what's going on. So I tell people start with education. Start with educating yourself listening to the people who've been doing this work longer than you and the people who are directly impacted, right? So a lot of people come in and they want to, start a movement or start a project or do this money or do these things, but like a lot of those platforms already exist. And so rather than creating something else that might complicate a movement that already exists, look at what the people are already doing and ask how you can help. So part of that is seeking feedback, being willing to receive it, right? And so sometimes that feedback is, we don't need you in this space, we need you over here. Being willing to accept that rather than shutting down or disappearing or distancing yourself. So there's really a lot of discomfort in this, and you might have really good intentions, but that doesn't always guarantee a good impact, and accountability is part of doing this well, right? So I think people, when they have that angst, they're like, let me act, let me do something, and sometimes we misstep. Being willing to take that feedback, and rather than retreating from the movement at all, saying, okay, where can I put myself that's maybe more effective? So I tell people, like, activism is not always popular. And so sometimes, yeah, you get that discomfort internally, but you can also have it externally. It can result in strained relationships. And I think especially for young people looking to get involved, but the work really matters. So you might have this discomfort. You might have hard conversations with people in your life. You might even lose people in your life. And so part of starting is deciding, like, what lane can I feasibly occupy in this? And there's so many lanes in activism. Some people, right, are in the streets, but some people are there and shouldn't be there based on whatever's going on. So the first question to ask yourself is, like, decide what your risk level is and act accordingly. So I talk about capital, and all people have capital, right? And that might be financial stability. It might be housing stability. It might be power and privilege in your communities, right? And so look at the capital that you have and decide how much of it you're willing to risk and lose. And that answer is going to be different for everybody. So there's high risk actions like civil disobedience, right? Where we see people out in their streets and out in their communities. That's high risk. And this is often what we're seeing in Minneapolis, right? The people out in the streets, on television. Like, this is not just simple work where people go out and hold a sign and have fun. It requires training and preparation and assessing your risk level, right? And so some people belong in that space and are prepared for it, but others look at more medium and low risk actions because these matter too, right? So this could be amplifying information that's already out there, donating resources, and that doesn't just mean financial, right? Offering logistical support. So a lot of people are giving, rides or dropping off food or opening their doors to people who need warm shelter. And sometimes it's just having those difficult one-on-one conversations, right? With the people in your life, your teammates, your coaches, your partners, whatever it might be. So your effective role may not look like somebody else's, and it may not be public at all. And that's okay. I think when we want to get involved, we think it has to be this big visible thing. There's so many people operating on the sidelines of these movements that do just as much important work. So you're wondering, should I get involved? Like, the real question isn't, am I doing this perfectly? But like, where is my skill set most useful? And what lanes allow me to stay engaged without burning out?
Tess, you said perfect twice, and so I can't resist popping in and saying that we often, when we're talking to coaches about coaching girls and women, one of the things that we say all the time is be brave, not perfect. And so I think that it's not coaching sports, but it's the exact same idea, right? Like, be okay to make the mistake, have it be a little messy, but show up. Get in there and do it, be brave, and it's not going to be perfect. So awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that, because a lot of athletes, things that make athletes really great are the same things that make activists great, right? Like willing to be uncomfortable, willing to persevere, willing to make mistakes and bounce back, willing to be part of a team. And so I think athletes can think about that. What are my strengths, maybe in sport or in the rest of my life? And how can that lend well to movements?
I think the other thing that's really cool, Tess, is, and I don't know, Christine and Quincy, you can speak to this as well, is finding your lane. That has been really cool to kind of watch and be a part of here in Minneapolis. And people have been really, the only word I can come to mind is unapologetic in owning their lane and doing it without apologizing for not doing enough. Like, everyone understands they've got different capacities. And there have been some folks in kind of my neighborhood chats where they're saying, I'm immunocompromised. So I'm going to do admin and spreadsheets. And then we've got other folks who are like, hey, I'm running daycare and school carpool anyway. So I'm happy to also do bus stop. and just everyone pitching in their own way has been so cool to see, because I think often people think of going to the streets and that's one way to show up, but there are so many other ways that are not even visible that others aren't seeing or realizing exist, right?
Another word that like comes to my mind with this conversation is kind of the word negotiation, especially, I'm an immigrant. I felt like I was, my position, right, in this community is threatened. And there was a point where, I'm somebody who likes to, I'm going to go out there. I'm going to be there with the sign, right? And this time having to really sit and negotiate with myself on what is my safety, and also where can I rely on my allies, right? This is this. We talk about lanes of like, okay, where can my allies show up in their lanes? So maybe something that athletes also have to negotiate with of their own identities and how their level of safety intersect with their advocacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What would you folks say about, I know some of the things that we've seen either online or some coaches may provide this advice of kind of, leaving it on the field, leave it at home, separate it. Christine's laughing because she's got the brain exploration, I'm sure, right? Like, leave it on the field or leave it at school, leave it at home. Just like this idea that we are expected to separate and compartmentalize. One, is that actually possible? And then is the expectation itself, is that helping? Is it hurting?
It's a thing that we've all heard. I had a coach literally put a backpack down and be like, this is where all your baggage goes. Now this is where we play the sports. And and so
done.
There it all goes. So I giggle at it because we know that it is out there. And number one, how would we ever, we're not robots. We can't turn ourselves off and on when we go onto the field. So I don't know if I have a very fancy brain explanation for it, but we know that our whole brain and body and feelings go everywhere, right? So that's going to impact how you show up on the field or the court or in the gym, wherever you are. And so I think pretending like that's a thing we can do does a disservice to our athletes. And I think the best coaches that I've had, and a coach that I hope that I am, is someone who invites that stuff. It's the opposite. It's bring that stuff, because that's part of what's going on with our team. So we're going to get a pulse on how everybody's feeling, because if I'm the coach, I'm going to adjust based on how folks show up. I will never forget my first season as a coach for a high school girls soccer team, and it was homecoming week, and it was the dresses. We were distracted. It was a completely different practice than I had planned, but because I knew what they were bringing to the field, we just changed it up and sort of honored the wholeness of them. And that's a silly example, but there are plenty of tough examples that go along with that. So let's honor our athletes as whole people and be allowed to bring our whole self to practice, I think.
Yeah, I love that so much. It's really what my work focuses on, is identity among athletes. I think we get so stuck on an athlete's an athlete, and we forget that they're people too, right? So I'm glad that you called this a myth, this idea that people can just shut up and dribble or leave it on the court. Mm-hmm. It is a myth. And what athletes do over time, because sport often starts so young for people, is they learn to compartmentalize really, really well, often out of necessity, right? So in high pressure moments in sport, narrow focus is really essential, and you have to learn to do that. Sometimes you have to cancel out the noise and perform in that moment. But the problem with athletes is that generalizes to so much else in their life, and they almost learn to compartmentalize too well, to the point that they forget to turn things back on. And especially if you're in an environment or you have a coach like that example just shared, who doesn't help you or encourage you to turn that back on, I think there's a lot of athletes that get into this young adulthood that really don't have a great sense of their identity and how to navigate maybe trauma or identity or these important conversations and movements, because no one's ever given them permission. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, when I work with athletes, it's so unrealistic to expect a career athlete to train daily while remaining unaffected by just these ongoing sociopolitical attacks on their identity. And if we extend it to Minnesota, right, it's so unrealistic to expect that these athletes can just ignore the violence affecting their communities and show up as if nothing happened. I think the Timberwolves demonstrated this really well yesterday in deciding, or 2 days ago, deciding to cancel their game, because you can't be expected to just turn all this off. And it is dangerous to expect people to do that. It's dangerous for people's physical health, for their mental health, for their overall well-being, for their communities. So yes, it's harmful. And when athletes, like I said, they learn to do this over time, when they suppress those parts of themselves or their lived reality for too long, they're going to resurface later. These things, they may not resurface that game or that day or that week, but they will come and show up, and often in these really unexpected or uncontrollable ways where maybe there isn't support available or it could have been contained sooner. And so when I talk about trauma in sport, it's so important that we address these things early on in athletes' experiences and careers, because, when we don't, that's when it shows up as emotional outbursts or injury or burnout or performance breakdowns in these really high stakes environment. And everyone's left wondering, gosh, could we have done something sooner? And the answer is almost yes. So the issue is not that athletes can't perform under stress. They do all the time. That's part of being an athlete. They do. The issue is that pretending that this stress, like you talk about, the compounding stress, the collective stress, the trauma and identity related stress, pretending that it doesn't exist and never addressing it creates so much more of a problem over time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for explaining that. Quincy, I want to move to you because I know you are in it in multiple ways, and you can speak to as many of those as you'd like. I think in general, just to get the ball rolling, how can athletes, like a lot of people are being told, and frankly, healthcare providers, so a lot of us, like, go easy, make sure you're resting, make sure you're recovering. How can athletes balance their need for rest and recovery if stepping away isn't always an option? Especially for due to financial pressures, or it's their livelihood, their cultural identities, obligations to the community, et cetera.
Yeah. And I want to say, before we even think about rest, I want to talk about the opposite first of the impact of oppressive system and their goal, right? What is their goal on a community? Is to make you feel powerless, right? It's to make you feel like you don't have control, you don't have agency over a lot of things that you do. So then we feel like sometimes we hold feelings of guilt and shame about having too much rest, right? Quote unquote, too much rest. So really having to rewrite or unpack that narrative that rest is shameful or rest has a guilt component to it. I can go on and whole nother soapbox. Rest is also a little bit intertwined with what do we call that? Consumerism. But that's a whole other thing.
Yes. Let's do a separate podcast episode on that.
But again, right? We know that oppressive systems win if we feel frozen. I think Christine, you talked about the brain and how it works when we feel like we're in danger. And frozen is kind of we either fight, flight, freeze, or some people fawn, fainting or dissociating or checking out. So then that's not rest, right? And at the same time, different people, we have different privileges, right? Let's say I had the privilege of time to go out and march yesterday, right? Not a lot of people have that, right? I had the privilege of protection from my peers, or I knew the city well enough that if I have to escape, I know where to run. So I have some privilege that I go back to that word negotiation that I have to negotiate with, and that includes rest, right? Rest has to be part of that negotiation as well. And we all have heard of the cliche term where somebody talks about in an airplane when there's an emergency and the air mask drops, right? And that cliche term is so true right now, that you have to put the air mask on over yourself before you take care of another person. Essentially, that looks like, what are your basic needs as an athlete at this moment, right? Are you hydrated? Do you have enough food? Have you eaten? Is your body in pain, right? Do you need a stretch? And also coming to the reality that part of rest is accepting that my workouts and my performance is going to look a little bit shitty the next few days, right? That maybe I'm not going to be sprinting 100%. I'm just going to be power walking. Right, I'm gonna be jogging for the next few days. But there's also that level of acceptance that also is included in rest.
Yeah, I've been telling a lot of people, like, reduce the intensity. I've been doing it without even asking my coach. I'm just doing it. And she's like, great. So, I did power walking yesterday. Instead of like, the treadmill run, I did half of the run on the treadmill. And then I was like, we're going to the walking pad. That's what we're doing. Done.
Yep.
Just because I knew my nervous system does not need more cardio right now. It's not serving me. It needs slower movement, right? It's hard. It's really hard. I'm curious, Quincy, how about that extra layer of, being an immigrant? How might the current climate around immigration be adding another layer of stress, complexity for folks in historically excluded or marginalized backgrounds or communities?
Yeah, this is why I pull in a lot of the work from Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality, right? Of that and as I talk about intersectionality, the landscape of what has been happening in Minneapolis have been changing so quickly. Like every second we have new news about different things. So it was primarily a target on immigrants, but now it's kind of a target on everybody here in Minnesota. So quick changing, and then the intersectionality of different identities come into play. But thinking about, especially me as an immigrant, and think about athletes who also hold immigrant or marginalized identities, then you have the additional layer of how does my identities impact my performance, how safe I feel around my teammates. Are my teammates trustworthy? Are my coaches trustworthy? Is my gym safe? Can I leave and go to my car safely? Can I go home? Did I bring my papers? Did I bring my green card? Did I bring my passport? Right? So again, it's all around safety, and there's that added layer of where your brain has to spend energy into thinking about it.
Just one more thing to stress about, essentially. It's just yep. I know, Christine, you've done a lot in terms of how to kind of care for those different parts of the brain. So folks who continue to be affected by this, there's the survival parts, there's the emotional parts. You, I know, have done some of these things. Can you speak to what helps us care for these parts, movement, singing, leaning into community, and why those things are helpful?
Yes. So the first thing that sort of stinks is we're caring for and trying to heal and care for ourselves in sort of the continued ongoing stressful situation, right? So it's we're not gonna fix it until the environment is fixed. And that's true for the current situation in Minnesota. And we can broaden that out to all of the oppression and systems of injustice in the United States and beyond. And if we're not going to burn out, if we're going to keep showing up, we can do little mini healings and fixings. And I told you those bottom two parts of the brain, those are the ones that can help us bring the stress response down. And I'm going to share a little bit about the science, but it's so I always love when I get to talk about this, because we know we remember from our Indigenous brothers and sisters and relatives, and we remember from the civil rights protests and era, and we remember, or ongoing era, we remember from when we had enslaved people in the United States, that people have been resisting and people have been using these sorts of mini healings for hundreds of years, right? In the United States and globally. But I'm going to tell you how they're showing up in Minnesota right now. So our survival brain, that very first, hey, am I safe? One super special thing about that part of the brain is that it loves rhythm. It loves rhythm, patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity. And it loves that because that very first part of our brain was developing when we were in utero. So the feeling of safety from in utero is connected to the heartbeat of the person who is carrying us, right? So our brain was hey, I'm safe. I hear that. So now when we're looking for safety, we're finding that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity. So maybe if we're a cycler, that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity helps us. Or if we're a runner or a swimmer or all of our distance friends, we find that patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity, and either knowing or not, that brings us a feeling of safety, right? It's in our team sports too. I think about the way that I do my cleans, and I always find a rhythm if I'm weightlifting. I'm looking for that. So safety and rhythm are so connected. And then we can double down on sort of their healing power if we include some do I belong, right? That second part of our brain, our emotional part of our brain. So if we can do rhythm with community, close friends, or just people, that rhythm and that community, that combination really hits. So I feel like, Quincy, I have a lower risk tolerance than you. I have not been over to the Whipple building, but I am out, and I went to the big march on Friday, and I found the big march on Friday to be one of the most healing things that has happened for me in a while, because I was walking with my community, and we were chanting and we were singing and we were listening to music, and I made friends with strangers, which is sort of typical for me, but it felt really nice.
That tracks.
To do together in this in this space, right? So that's one example. And then I tried something new. I'm not a singer. I've got sort of a mediocre voice, but I went to an event by the Singing Resistance here in the Twin Cities, and we went into a church. And I went by myself. I didn't know anybody. And so I just sat down. But something happened to me where I walked in and they were already singing. I was a little late. And I just the tears came. They came so hard. And there was a stranger sitting in the pew, and she opened her arm for me. And I scooted into this stranger's arm. And I cried. And I cried, and then I sang, and then I cried some more. And then somebody came and sat down next to me. It was a young person who looked at me, and I was like, oh, am I going to get judged in here? And he didn't judge me. He left and found me this big giant wad of Kleenexes, because I was like, where do I put all this? It's wet down here. It wasn't cute. And I just think rhythm and community showed up for me again. And I think the more places we can find those two things, not staying home, or maybe staying home, but finding rhythm and community at home, but finding your spot, Tess, like you were saying, finding some people to be with, and doing that type of work. So those are my two recent rhythm and connection moments.
I don't know if either of you saw the drum. There were a bunch of drum sets that they set up on the Stone Arch Bridge.
Yeah, that one was
It gave
cool.
me chills. And I also started tearing up. And it was just so cool. All of these full-on drum sets, and they're all drumming together. I get goosebumps thinking about it. It was really special.
I've seen really cool. It's a part of the brass solidarity band that goes out to protest and plays music. Very much in line. Yeah.
An incredible example. They're great. I've heard them. That's so fun.
Incredible. Yeah. Such cool people.
Yeah. Yeah, we also had, I know there were a lot of vigils on Saturday. I went to our local neighborhood vigil, and everyone was singing. And a lot of us are self-identified poor singers. Yeah. And it was so cool. Just people of all ages, all abilities. And then different people would know the song lyrics that others didn't. And so then they'd take the mic, and it was just such a cool, special community and bringing everyone together. So,
right.
And I think it's beautiful. We even saw Indigenous healers come out and share space with the community in Minneapolis. And I think there's something to be said about this movement in particular in Minneapolis might be new, but the movement overall is not. So Indigenous people, people of color, have been navigating these same kind of oppressive systems for a really, really long time. And just that power of community, of people coming in, and sort of that, it is a collective oppression. It is collective trauma. But there is some type of power in being seen by others and sharing the space with others, that it just acknowledges I see and share your suffering. With everything going around, I just think you shared a beautiful story of being able to sit with people, and that can be healing too.
Yeah. I know, Tess, I don't know if this is something that you've experienced or been seeing in clinical work lately. Quincy, you may have as well, Christine, with your athletes, I definitely have, is this idea of like, how do I know the difference between just flat out avoidance versus like authentic rest and boundary setting? I'm thinking specifically about social media. A good number of folks, understandably removing Instagram, which I'd argue probably a good decision, Instagram or social media apps. And then, how do you know if it's a quote unquote healthy relationship with social media connection, texting, technology, or just flat out avoidance?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And there's not a perfect answer, right? No textbook to say like, hey, I'm using this in healthy ways or not. But I think we have to look at timing and context. So avoidance is a coping mechanism. That's what it is, right? So it's a coping mechanism that can be really necessary and protective in the short term. It helps us maybe put some relief on our nervous system. It helps us avoid ongoing distress, right? Or remove ourselves from dangerous situations. So avoidance is not inherently bad. Now, I think we said it great earlier that if someone's navigating trauma and violence currently, or they're in these environments where things are going on, it's just not realistic to ask people to like engage in deep problem solving or deep emotional processing. It's not helpful in that window. So avoidance may be necessary in those moments. Now, in those cases, I try not even to use the term avoidance because I think it gets a bad rap, but as like intentional compartmentalization. So intentionally, you need to set that piece aside because we can't go there yet. It's not safe to do so yet. And especially when we're asking athletes and other performers to like perform through these places, like it's okay sometimes to shut it off. I think you have to. And we have to give people that permission, right? And so with the athletes I work with, like if you need to turn it off to get through practice or class or competition or a social or family obligation, do that. You still get to be present for your life when these things are going on. But the key is remembering to turn it back on. And that's where timing matters and context matters. So we cannot keep that shut off forever. That's where we experience these long-term consequences. So turning it back on can look different for everyone. Now, it doesn't have to mean you go out into the streets, right, to face this if that's not for you, but it can mean starting slow. It can mean journaling how you're feeling, talking with trusted people or that occupy lanes that you may fit better in. It can be working with a professional if that's what you need, or boundary setting in your life of like, this is when I can go on social media and this is when I can't. These are the accounts I can follow and these are the ones that I can't. And I think looking at that in your life, like these are more effective long-term coping strategies than avoidance is. So you need that in the short term, but not in the long term. So now the key here, I think, is when trauma is severe or long-standing. And I think that's what we're going to see in Minneapolis over time, is this is not ending tomorrow, that like those strategies aren't enough. We can't tell people like, go journal, go to therapy, go take a bath, and that's going to be enough. I think we talk about self-care too much and not enough about like community care and nervous system care. So in those cases, what someone might need to actually function and perform is rest for their nervous system in whatever that looks like for you, completely shutting it off, right? This can mean stepping away from certain conversations or people or environments or movements, including sport, for a period of time. And I don't think we talk about that enough. And that's why I was really proud of what the Timberwolves did, is like sometimes it's okay to say sport is not the most important thing right here. Going on that jog or, going to the gym is not the most important thing in this moment. And I don't think that's avoidance. I think that's intentional compartmentalization, or that's intentional rest. So the distinction I tell people in the moment when you're faced with that decision, avoidance creates distance from a problem that continues to accumulate over time. Rest restores our capacity to face those things by supporting recovery and connection. So if you need to avoid in the short term and you need that distance, that's okay. But rest is ultimately what's going to create some sustainability for you and healing and ability to make it through these things in the long haul.
Kind of like resist resistance in this case.
Yeah. Trisha hearsay. How about, Christine, I know you've done a lot of work. You do a lot with just, helping coaches, consulting. What have you learned about using sport, and we could say community, just as a form of social action? What does that look like for athletes these days? How can they engage in work that feels authentic and sustainable without burning themselves out? Some of what, Tess spoke about earlier, not exhausting themselves and wanting to do all of the things right away.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to try to answer it. But friends, pop in if I'm missing the boat, or redirect me, Erin, if I need it. I think sort of what I'm thinking about is that part of this whole story is like making sure each other are okay. And that's like Elaine, I think. And I think we've got teams set up in a great way to do that, is to make sure that we're okay as our community and support each other, however that looks like. And so I think one thing that there's two ways that we can think about this. One thing that I think is sort of like a long-term positive about teams and team sports broadly is that it gives us sort of like a way to understand people who are different than us and sort of move them from a category, right? Remember, we're talking the lower parts of our brain. So move them from a category of like, I don't know anybody like that, race, gender identity, sexuality, whatever it is. I don't know anyone like that, to I do know somebody like that. And over time, making those people who are different than us, religion, whatever, feel safe and familiar, right? And so I think sort of in a long-term way, sport is one of our ways that we can move towards dismantling those broader systems of oppression and making sure that people are seeing each other as they are, and making sure that when I meet somebody else, like my teammate, my brain, not just my like thinking brain, but my low parts of my brain where my implicit bias is, my implicit bias brain says, oh, my nervous system is safe around someone like that. I already know somebody like that. So we've got sort of this like long-term moving towards social justice that I think sport plays a really pivotal role in doing. So that's one answer. Do I have time to give my other answer?
Totally. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. So then the other answer that I have is like in this short-term moment that we have here in Minnesota, in these sort of communities that we have networks already set up. There's networks all over the Twin Cities, and some of them are sports. So I've seen one of my favorite, oh, can I say that? They're not my favorite, but they're kind of my favorite group. Fred Wells Tennis and Education Center.
Oh, you can totally give them a shout out. Yes.
Fred Wells Tennis and Education Center. One thing that I've watched them do in this moment is that the networks that they already had set up because of their programming, the families that they already knew and had relationships with, they're able to support in a non-tennis way. They've got young people that don't feel comfortable coming to play tennis right now. They're unsafe to do that. So Fred Wells and their incredible team, it's not Fred Wells, actually, it's the staff of Fred Wells they switched over to grocery deliveries. And so they're sending groceries out to their families every week. And it's a big operation, and they totally switched what they were doing. And they're not the only group to switch what they're doing. Other sports programs are doing similar things that are pretty awesome. So I love that. But then, so for our young people who can't arrive, I think that's an incredible solution. For our young people who can arrive, guess what? Sport has rhythm and connection. So if we can feel safe to play, then we should go play. We should be in community with our team and our coaches and our friends. And maybe it looks like a walk instead of a run, but we should go and be together.
You know, it's interesting because I came to the U.S. as an international student for my undergrad, and I found like a Frisbee team on campus that I immediately joined. And I often tell people like that immediately gave me 20 new friends, right? So it's that like connection piece and the unique piece about like team sports that's so important here.
Yeah, and I just want to say again, what makes sports athletes and people in sports so good at activism and these things is what you're describing, that they're already members of communities that are often really powerful. The ability to be flexible and adapt to the time and the needs, you need that in sport. And sport is inherently the most diverse thing out there, right? So we just have people of all shapes, genders, sizes. I think of a football team, and I when I'm talking about diversity, I tell people, what if every single player looked and thinked exactly like the quarterback, right? Your team would be crap. And so sport is diverse, sport is flexible and adaptive, and sport is a community. And those are all of the things these movements need.
The other thing that comes to mind for me is this idea of social action and these like very I guess the academic term would be like micro validations or micro interventions. Like, so, these little moments where you can show up as an ally or an accomplice and saying like, hey, like, let's revisit what you just said. Or what did you mean by that statement? And so I'm thinking like the locker room talk or even body talk amongst like text messages and friends groups. Like, what are the things that people might be saying and not realizing how like emotionally loaded some of those statements are, or how damaging or harmful they could be. And then having a teammate or a coach being like, hey, like I noticed this thing and da 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 da, right? Being able to just say like, hey, let's talk about this. Or we don't say those things here. And here's why. Like those can also be really powerful forms of social action that I think a lot of people don't give themselves enough credit for. So I guess for the athletes listening now who are overwhelmed, exhausted, numb is another word that I've been hearing a lot the past couple of weeks. What are a couple of small concrete things that they can do like today or tomorrow just to care for themselves and the community?
I think the best thing they can do is not forget to move their body. I think that everybody should walk, don't run, or run if that feels good, but make sure that we've got some movement. That's it's important for our physical health, but I think right now the like mental health benefits of moving our bodies are so important. So I think move your body. I'll let somebody else answer for the community, I think.
I was actually going to mention something about that. We think about collective trauma, and even in the presence of trauma, there's also healing, right? So there's also so there's that collectiveness in leaning on your community, leaning on your friends, your teammates, or even your coaches, to get that support here. And I often try to challenge that systems of oppression makes individuals feel like the whole burden and pressure of solving it is on an individual, right? And we know that as an individual, it's really hard to change a systemic problem. And it takes a whole system to change a systemic problem. So this is, again, where your team comes in really handy here, that collective healing.
Yeah, I love what was said. I think moving your body and staying connected are two really important things that athletes can do during this time. Tap into the resources that you already have, right? I think we have these stores of coping skills and resources, and tap into the ones that already work for you. The last thing I would add is, like, if you are one of those people experiencing that angst and there's really this need to ask. The question is ask. Where can you contribute? There's great sort of graphics that are being put out on like ways that you can help Minneapolis right now. Lists of it, right? Like, what's one small thing that you can do? If you have a friend in Minneapolis or you're there, reach out to them, ask what's one thing that you could do. Maybe you have a teammate or a coach that's there. Maybe they're at home or they're on a break or they're from there. Check in on those people. So I think doing one thing, if you feel that angst, most of us can't fly out to Minneapolis despite our hearts maybe really wanting to be there, but ask the people on the ground, the people who are impacted, the people that are from there, where you can be useful. And that, I think, helps with that angst. Like, don't leave that unchecked, because that can cause some issues for people too.
I have two more questions. One I didn't tell you I'm going to ask, but I'm also confident all of you can answer it, and I'll answer it myself if needed. Is calling people in and moving the needle and leaning into difficult conversations. There's a lot of talk about shaming and cancel culture. So when I think about what's likely happening in the brain, and what I know about shame is that may not be the most effective way to move the needle. So what advice or tips do you have for folks who like want to have the difficult conversations, or they want to call someone in or out? How do we do that effectively?
Yeah, I'll start with just saying that, like, what's right isn't always what's popular. Mm-hmm. And knowing that sometimes you'll go into these conversations and you could lose capital. Like I've said before, mm-hmm. Like, you may have people that disagree with you. You may lose status. You may lose friends over that. And so deciding, like, again, what do you have to risk and what is most important to you, and being okay with that. And I think that's hard, but I tell people there are a lot of folks in this conversation that are kind of right on the line, and the like, I've believed or felt this way for really long, and now I'm seeing this thing and it doesn't feel right, and that's conflicting. It's really hard for people to change their mind in the face of new evidence. It's really hard. But there are a lot of people on that edge, and I tell people, like, put your energy there. We all have people in our lives that maybe sometimes feel too far gone, and they can turn abusive if you try and call them in. And so be thinking about the resources you have and where they're best spent. You get to make decisions to protect kind of your own safety, right? And decide, I'm not going to have that conversation with that person. But the last thing I'll say, even if you do decide to maybe have the conversation with that person or on that Facebook, right? Don't always do it because you're expecting something from the other person. Like, you may not change that person's mind. You may not get something back from them, but there are immigrants on that person's Facebook. There are queer people on that person's Facebook that are going to see those things that you say and feel less alone in those spaces. So don't go into this with expectations. Be willing to kind of protect yourself and do the uncomfortable thing, but know that anything that you say, you may not get an outcome. You may not get closure or something out of it, but you're still making an impact.
Well, I think about research shows that we don't change through shame or guilt. That's not how humans change. But another thing that I like to ask my clients to reflect on is kind of turn it around, right? Let's say if you got a challenging feedback from a coach or from a teammate, how would you like to receive it? What is the best language that you like to receive? What is the tone that you like to receive that allows you to take on that difficult feedback or that difficult comment? Do that to the other person. I think that's a really good example. All of us as athletes, we have received very difficult feedback and changes that we have to do for our performance here, and that might be a really great place to start.
Can I answer it too, even though these are both lovely answers?
Yes, you can.
I feel like I've learned so much that I'm going to take for myself. So thank you for your incredible insight, all three of you. I think for me on this one, I'd like to think about, like, so we already talked about one brain, right? So when we're having a challenging conversation, it's two brains. So if I'm going to call someone out, I have to have access to my cortex, into my executive brain, in order to say it the way that I want to say it. And they also have to be in their cortex for them to hear me the way that I want them to hear me. So I think a lot of times somebody will say something and my first instinct is to be like, F that. Like, I'd like to yell at you right now for that thing that you just said.
Yeah.
And really the smarter move, and something that I'm getting better at doing, is like taking a beat, like making sure that I am ready, and remembering that we can always say that at a different time too. We can always go back when everybody is a little more chill and have that conversation then. So I think the timing of the conversation can really make a difference.
I'm so glad you said that, because great feedback. Because I used to be like the Facebook fighter. I'm like, I will call you out on anything. Sometimes
Same.
I do.
I feel like all of us probably were.
Yeah, and there's just some things I can't resist. But really good feedback someone gave me at one point is it's more important to be effective than it is to be right.
Yeah.
And I think I sometimes was approaching it of like, I want to be right. I want to convince these people, like, how can you not see the human rights violations in front of you? And it's like, sometimes we need to ask ourselves, like, what is most effective in this space? And sometimes that's saying nothing to that person in particular. Sometimes it's coming back at a different time. Sometimes it's saying it in a different way. And one thing I really think of, we know this from research, is that storytelling is really effective. Yeah. And when people approach less of like, I want to change your mind or get you on my side, and I just want to share my story, how this has impacted me or my community, how I feel, what this has been like for me, that storytelling, everyone can relate to. Everyone can relate to, experiencing fear or fear for a loved one. So approaching it more, let me tell my story rather than trying to convince you or change you, can actually get us more on the same page.
Can I add one more thing? I want to add a layer of, I think, again, intersectionality. And sometimes, people of color or people of marginalized communities feel the burden to educate others, right? And maybe this is complete opposite of what I just said earlier on, but also holding boundaries, right? Of like knowing when do you put in the effort to educate somebody, or Or we know that that person's not going to change their mind. So why take on more of that burden or why engage in somebody who we know will harm us, right? So I think, again, there's a duality of like, okay, how much do I step in, call in somebody, or how much do I preserve my energy so that I could preserve myself and also preserve my community.
Quincy, I'm going to say thank you for saying that, because one of the things that I know is my responsibility as a cis white woman is to talk to other cis white people about this type of thing. And I think it's my responsibility for many reasons. One of them is so that people who are not cis white people don't have to do it.
Yeah.
And also because when I say it, it's easier for somebody whose biases are that way. It's easier for them to hear it from me. So I think that's a great lane for anyone with the privileges that I have to find themselves in, is to sort of learn what to say, not about like your own identity, but to say something like, I already learned this thing. I just learned this. That's nice. Mm-hmm. Even if you've known it for a long time, you just say, I just learned this. And maybe that would be something that's interesting to you. So anyone who's listening, that's a great lane for you to find too.
Yep.
Final question for the three of you, though I'm sure we could do plenty of these, is for folks who want to learn more, for the listeners who are like, okay, cool. What's next? Any resources, kind of books, podcasts, thought leaders who you'd recommend? Christine's looking at her bookshelf. As like go-to things for people who want to continue to do this work.
I noticed that my two favorite ones are lent out. Nice. They're not here right now. Oh, wait, I have one. It's still in its printing package because I just got a new set.
Nice.
So this is called the Nothing Heals Like Sport Playbook. And it is written by the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport, where I work mostly, Megan Bartlett, who's our founder. And so if the brain stuff is interesting, it's written towards a coach. But I think an athlete could easily sort of like make the adjustment for them. And then the other one that I would pull out is What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah. If you're an audiobook person, it's a lovely listen, but a lovely read too.
The one I enjoy sharing with clients is called Beyond Ally by Dr. Maisa Akbar. She does an incredible job. And I think what her book talks about was more around like allyship around, especially during George Floyd time, of like, how do we talk about race and race related issues with folks. Still very relevant till today. I mean, it has been relevant this whole time. But she has like she takes on a really compassionate and non-judgmental way of how do we become allies. And she walks you through the different isms and how do you either unpack or reflect or sit with the isms that you may or may not hold. So I really like that one.
I love all these shared so far. I think my recommendation is like find the organizations out there that are already doing what you want to do and join rather than start from scratch. And I think you've shared some great ones. Some ones that come to mind for athletes specifically are Athlete Ally. Does a great work around gender equity in sport, and they hold an athlete activism summit each year. Just provide some really great resources. I think about LGBTQ athletes specifically, but also just the broader community of how do we be good allies? How do we show up for our communities in sport? There's some other, like We Ride Together around preventing sexual abuse and violence in sport. There's Athletes for Impact, which helps people actually start some of these more grassroots social justice campaigns. For athletes, like sometimes it's not out there. The thing that we want is not out there. And so how might you use some existing resources to leverage that in creating your own movements? I also think when it comes to specific movements, like let's say Minneapolis, like look at Minneapolis and look at what they need and what they're asking for and what already exists. So I think sometimes, again, it's not about recreating something new, but it's looking at what does the community actually need and what resources are valuable there. So one I'll shout out is that there is a provider and organization in Minneapolis right now that is providing free training for psychologists and therapists around trauma and around community crisis. So these providers, both in Minneapolis and beyond, are equipped to serve people that are maybe out in the streets doing this work, to people who are impacted by this community surveillance and violence. And so look at these resources that are already out there. They almost always exist, and take advantage of them.
If you're in Minneapolis, there's a women's sports bar, a bar of their own. I'm not sponsored by them, but they do a really good job of showing an example of how the intersection between sports and advocacy and social justice. Really great.
A bar of their own, please sponsor this podcast. We love you. They're amazing. They're doing, I mean, and I think the thing that has been so cool to see with them specifically is their emphasis on mutual aid. Is being like, go straight to the folks and the families who need it. Here, go to our stories. I mean, that's a really great example of how to show up. And I don't know if they've been in the streets or not. And frankly, it doesn't matter, because they've made a huge impact on their, like, using their social network and their web of connections to put people in touch with one another. The folks who have financial resources, here you go, and helping the families who need it most right now. So.
I think about, like, Tess, you mentioned, like, not everybody can be a quarterback, right? Same thing, right? In advocacy, right? You need, like, your different, like, positions. So you need your coaches, you need, like, your sponsors, you need the, volunteers. So we have, like, a lot of people in there's a lane for everybody.
Yeah. And that makes me think of, like, a lot of people go into these movements, like, they want to change the world. They want to do something big. They want to make things better. And I don't want to minimize that for people, but I think let's, like, reconceptualize what changing the world means. And it's, when you brought up mutual aid, made me think of it as, like, for me, changing the world is like leaving every person, place, or environment better than it was before you. And so if that means you contribute to one mutual aid, one family needs diapers, or one person needs a ride, or one person needs help doing some research on finding legal assistance, like, doing that one thing is changing the world. And rather than people feeling like, I have to do this major thing or it's not enough, let's remember that it is the combination of all these collective actions that actually changes policy and actually changes what things look like for people in their communities on the ground. So playing even one small part in that the sum of all those parts is what changes the world.
Yep. Very cool. Thank you all so much. Before we leave, I'd love to give you the opportunity to share more about, like, how folks can track you or your work down, where they can find you, for the new fans in the audience.
This is always the part I hate least. So I'm glad I'm in good company, but I will take the hit. So you can find me at Unapologetic Psychology. I think we used that term a little bit earlier.
Yeah, we did.
So Unapologetic Psych is kind of just the message of my practice and what we do from a really liberation psychology standpoint. We work with athletes, performers, and minoritized populations in and across all of those spaces. So unapologeticpsych.com, same thing on Instagram, is where you can find me and my team.
And you provide mental health therapy and performance consulting, correct?
Yes, we provide both. We also provide a lot of organizational consultation, training, workshops, podcasts, things like that, to look at more system level factors that are impacting athletes and performers.
Very cool. How about you, Christine?
Okay. I was Quincy, you go next. I'll do my best. Usually Claire helps me, and I'm going to wing it on my own. Hi, Claire. You can find the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport at chjs.org on the socials, or at chjs.org, like, website. This note here says #NothingHealsLikeSport. So you can follow our hashtag too. We often work with sports teams or organizations, coaches, parks and rec centers, things of that nature, to do training and consulting. And we also do some collective action and movement building work to adjust the system of sport so that it's more equitable and accessible for more young people.
My Asian culture is telling me not to highlight myself, but to highlight you.
I had a feeling that would happen.
I have like 10 different people that I want to shout out to. Yes, I guess my work is a little bit different, where I just do like outpatient assessment where I do like testing, either like ADHD, learning disabilities, mental health testing. I see like a very select group of like immigrants for individual therapy. My passion lies in like systemic change. So I guess my shout out would be get involved with like professional organizations, legislative organizations. That's where the power is, right? Of that, like it takes a collective to make systemic change, not an individual.
Very cool. All right. Thank you all so much. Really appreciated you taking the time for this conversation and sharing all of your pearls of wisdom.
Thank you.
That's the heart of what so many of us have been feeling. This mix of urgency, uncertainty, and some of us a deep pull to do something. And what makes this conversation so valuable is that it gives us permission to be strategic about our capacity and to show up in whatever lane feels both authentic and sustainable. Here's what stood out for me. Collective trauma is real and it shows up in your body, whether you're directly targeted or not. Rest is not avoidance when it's intentional. It's how we stay in the work long term that's most important. Activism has different lanes, and you get to negotiate yours based on your identities, your capital, and your risk tolerance. Community and rhythm are healing tools, even if you're a bad singer. And there's nothing wrong with sticking to training or leaning into your team when things get rough. And perhaps most importantly, you don't have to have it all figured out to get started. So here's your challenge. Pick one lane, one action, one way you can show up this week that feels true to who you are and what you can sustain. And if you need help figuring out what that looks like, revisit the resources our guests shared. They're all linked in the show notes. If this conversation landed for you, please share it. Send it to a teammate, a coach, someone navigating their own version of this angst. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next, because we are not done leaning into the difficult conversations and these important topics. Thanks for being here. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Thanks for tuning in to the Feisty Women's Performance Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, review, and share. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not establish a therapeutic relationship. In other words, I'm a licensed psychologist, but not your licensed psychologist. Always consult your healthcare provider before making important decisions about your health. Find show notes and resources at feisty.co. Join us next time as we continue to move the needle in women's health and performance via evidence-based conversations. Until then, keep living your healthiest, feistiest, active life.